Hi everyone, welcome. In the past, you've seen me use these yellow buckets before. However, the two that you see here, numbers 4 and 5, were never used. In the past, we've always gone with using buckets number 1 through 3. But I do have 5 of these. And as you probably saw a moment ago, these things already have some stuff in them. And what they've got is just some shredded paper, cardboard, some leaves. I even threw some food in there. These bins were built a week ago now. And I was thinking I would do something in these sort of similar to what I did in them last time. Last time I ran European Nightcrawler breeder bins, breeder buckets. And this time I thought I would give it a try with red wigglers. So I've got to get some worms rounded up with which we can launch off these breeder buckets. So let me show you what I got in mind for that. So it's the two systems I've got listed here on this board that I've got in mind for possibly rounding up the recruits that we could use to launch off those systems. Now, I guess breeder bins, they suggest 100 worms per 1 gallon of bedding, and that's going to put them into a spacious enough accommodation where it's going to trip off the mating response so that they start breeding. So in those buckets I've got what I estimate to be about 2 gallons, so somewhere around 200 worms per bucket would be ideal. So 200 times 5, I need 1,000 worms to get this job started. Let's see, so really quick, just this oldest system that you see here, it's the one that's up on the top right corner of the shelving system back there. That thing had a buddy bin. As I do sometimes, I run bins as little buddy paired up match sets. That one 5 days ago got light harvested. So with the light harvesting method, I was able to be pretty discriminant, pretty careful about getting almost all the worms out of the material. But still, I had the material full of cocoons, so I dumped it all into that big bus box up there, so that maybe the cocoons can hatch and they can get rounded up at some point later on. I thought I might take a somewhat less discriminate approach to try to round up the worms on this go-around. And that idea was just to do something I've seen used on other worm channels, is just to screen the material and grab all the largest worms and all the finished castings, all the cocoons, all the little itsy bitsy tiny worms would all fall through. And then what I could do with what comes through the screen is something sort of similar to this, or maybe I can even dump the material in here, just throw all the castings, cocoons, and I'm going to be, attempting to round worms up out of this at some point in the future anyway. What's the harm in just throwing another couple, systems worth of material in there with cocoons and babies to be rounded up at a later time, and, capturing all the larger sized worms in the screen. So now the other system that I had listed here is the one that's right below it, and if you look at the numbers, they're almost identical. 1 day difference. There's only 1 day that separates these two systems from each other, and in effect it does seem like these probably should have been the buddy bins. I guess the only reason I kept that one separate, the youngest of them, was because those worms came from a somewhat different location. They came from the compost barrel, so I always treated them a little bit special. Always thought I might return them to the compost barrel, but that idea went away, and we figured we'd keep them down here in the wormery. So, I don't know, I'm going to get the screen. We're going to start running that material through the screen to see how many worms we can capture, and hopefully we can get these breeder buckets launched off in a short period of time. So I'm going to get a glove on and we're going to get to work. So now in the past, the only stuff that was getting caught in the screen was just larger sized debris, which was just going to be put off on the side and probably reintroduced as uncomposted material that still needs more time to get done. Here, what we're catching is the worms themselves. So I almost have this feeling like I want to go through a little bit of a rehearsal. So I'm imagining scooping material up into the screen, giving the whole thing a little bit of a shake, but not so much that all the worms fall through. And once I've got the worms, grabbing this and emptying the worms that I've captured into this green tub, and repeat. So I guess that's one way to play it. we can try to get some of this material out of the way. Now in this system we were composting cotton materials, and it may have even been the last check-in or one of the previous check-ins recently when we finally extracted all that stuff. Another thing that had been going on in here was we had fed a bunch of material to these worms inside of cardboard tubes, and I left all the cardboard tubes out here on the top surface, thinking that if the worms want to nibble on that stuff, they could. I half expected to find a big pile of cardboard, and I'm finding virtually none. So that's pretty good. Not a whole lot of leftovers here. And you know, this stuff here, all these little scraps of cardboard and whatnot, little chunks of leaves or whatever, sticks, all that stuff is going to get captured in the screen along with the worms too. Now, in the past check-in, we had combined a lot of the dry material from the side opposite of where the feedings had been getting applied into the material on this side to try to dry it all off and make it a lot more crumbly and loose. And I really hope that this stuff is loose enough to just go right through the screen. It certainly seems that way. Some of it seemed like it might still be too damp, and that was the reason I took a whole bunch of the dry stuff from the opposite end and blended it in so that the more damp stuff could possibly dry a little bit by having the more dry material added to it. So, I don't know, I'm so reluctant to just get into it, but maybe we should just go for it, right? I was tempted to start on the end that has material that's probably almost worm-free at this point, which had just been sitting here drying. So maybe that is a good idea. Maybe I'll start with that as sort of just a practice to see how it all goes, see how much I could fit into the screen, see what it takes to run this stuff through and make it all pass through the screen. I really did get that feeling like this stuff was nice and loose to the point where it should almost all just go right through. I guess with the exception of larger chunks of food or whatever. But, you know, I mean, this was meant to sort of be a, you know, a fairly quick process. So, oops, making a mess already. I guess I'm going to see what I can do about just keeping the process moving along pretty good. Now, I just feel compelled to get this material back into play over here since I just kind of tossed it over the side. And you can see I've got some stuff here, the more dry, clumpy stuff. Not dry, I guess I thought it would be the dry, clumpy stuff on the surface, but this stuff actually feels like it might be too damp. Like that's the reason it's not passing through. And, you know, since there's no worms in it, it almost seems to me like this stuff should just go with the finished castings because it's not worms, and the reason I'm doing this is to catch worms in the screen. So it's a little bit of trial and error, I've got to admit. So why don't we just take this catch and just include it with the stuff that did pass through. Kind of makes me want to just go right for the side that's got the worms in it to see how we do as far as actually capturing worms. Start amassing a little collection of worms over here. So, I don't know why I'm nervous. I guess because I've never taken this approach before. You know, why don't we just give it a go and see what we end up with? How does that sound? Stuff definitely feels pretty damn damp. I don't know why I'm getting nervous about this. It almost feels like I should blend in some of this drier stuff just to help it all, you know, not be clumpy like this, right? That was the whole idea, was that the stuff would pass right through the screen, leaving worms behind. Recruits that we could use for our project here. Gosh. I'm almost wondering, like, am I going to get to the point where I just decide to abandon this? Try migrating the worms instead? You know, let's give this a try. Let's try blending in some of this more dry, granular stuff while we still have some of it over here. Stuff seems awfully damp. Just get this feeling like it's not going to want to pass through the screen. It's just going to be a big pile of mud. Decisions. Let's add more dry. Perhaps we can actually blend in enough dry material to make it all loose enough to help it all pass through and maybe allow us to make this happen as envisioned. Maybe not. I guess, you know, you never know until you try, right? It already feels like I'm hitting stuff over here too that's already so damp that it would just not want to pass right through the screen. You know, I just had this different sort of impression of this material from the last check-in, how it felt a lot more loose and crumbly and flowing. Perhaps I should not have covered up so thoroughly. And, well, you know, the other bin too. The other bin is covered with a piece of bubble wrap over the entire surface. And even though over there too I had this feeling like the material was really nice and loose and crumbly, I'm really questioning whether it's going to behave the way we would like it to in the screen. I mean, it's a big enough screen, and hopefully I don't know, the worms that I'm trying to capture are the larger size worms, because breeder systems are really supposed to have just the adults. So if the little tiny ones pass through, that's really almost a desirable effect too. And then later on we probably round up the material, round up the worms in all that other material with some sort of a baiting or a migration approach. I don't know. I feel like I'm just being overly nervous here. We gotta try it, don't we? How else will we know if we can pull it off? But I'm not gonna load it up too much. I think we're gonna just see what we can do. Give this stuff a jiggle, see what it behaves like. I got to admit, I definitely envisioned this being mostly worms and much fewer clumpy castings. And it just seems like even though we've got a whole bunch of other material in here, maybe we do just... Or do we abandon? I'm really... I don't know. All this stuff, all this extra stuff that I really didn't envision being with what I was going to launch into the breeder buckets. I mean, there is a good number of worms, you know. I mean, there's clumps of castings here, but a good number of worms hanging out in it too. It almost feels like, I don't know, perhaps the way to play this is to just let the stuff dry further. Make it a lot more manageable for a process like this. Because right now it just feels like this material is too damp and it's really working against me. And as much as I'd like to get those breeder buckets launched off, I'm in no hurry. Like I've said multiple times, I'm in no hurry. And I've been pretty, what's the right word? I guess jealous, a little envious, watching other people take their material and just, you know, shake it through the screen and be left with pretty much worms only. And I guess you just need material that's a lot drier. A lot drier than this is to be able to make that happen. So perhaps that can be accomplished by blending in the drier materials with the more damp materials, leaving the cover off, letting it sit another 10-12 days. So I believe it's been 10 or 12 days now since we last checked in on these. And at that time we talked about maybe light harvesting, maybe setting up a migration, even then mentioning how we're not in a particular hurry. But it just felt like I had to give it a try, you know. I mean, if nothing else, it does seem like perhaps the more dry material that has already shaken through the screen could just be added over into the more damp stuff, perhaps blending the entire contents of the material together, the more dry stuff with the more damp stuff, leaving it uncovered, and hopefully being able to come back to this at a later point in time and to be able to actually do it successfully. I don't know. It's a little saying in Hungarian, aki meros nyer. And that just basically translates into whoever it is, you know, that person who is willing to try, med, I guess med means is willing to risk failure. Med? Is that the right way to think of that? Well, either way, nyed is win, right? So the only person that's going to win is that person who tries. But it does feel to me like maybe the best bet here is going to be to try to bring over as much of the dry stuff that was on this side of the bin, and kind of as a result do away with the whole concept of one side of the bin being where the worms and the moisture is and the other side of the bin being where the dryness is. Kind of blending it all together so that the more damp stuff can possibly dry a bit by having the dry stuff blended into it. So I don't know, I mean, it does all feel nice and flowing, but it just feels like when the rubber hits the road and you really want to make it happen, it just doesn't feel like it's quite there yet. And maybe another week from now, if we leave it perhaps completely uncovered, the material on the top, maybe ½ inch, would dry nicely. We could blend it in again. And maybe we'll just have to wait. We'll just have to wait until we can actually successfully make this happen. I mean, the material is pretty far finished. There is always that option to try to migrate the worms and set up a migration zone. But I've always really been interested in just, you know, using the screening method to get the worms separated from the material they're in. It just seems like the material needs to be a lot more granular and loose than this stuff is. I'm sure the worms love it the way it is right now, being nice and damp. But it's not suiting our needs. And we got a whole bunch of stuff that we actually picked out of here too, so I'm just wondering what to do with that stuff. Perhaps just leave it out. Maybe that's the way to do it. I don't know. Do we even check in on the other system, or do we simply uncover it and let both systems dry? I'm getting this feeling like that's just going to be more of the same frustration in the other system, and perhaps the best bet is just to grab that bin too and uncover it, possibly blend it together so that the more dry materials, in that case the dry materials are on the outer edges because that system was being fed down the middle, whereas this system was being fed on the edge. Yeah, you know, I think that's going to be the way to play it. This is pretty much the way we're going to be putting it back up on the shelf. Let it dry, and what we'll do in the other one is give the whole thing a stir, and then we'll come back to them at some point in the near future and see if it's possible to try again. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people are just, you know, kind of banging the table saying, you know, you didn't try hard enough. I don't know. I got a gut feeling that this would have just led to a whole bunch of frustration. I didn't want to deal with it. So why don't I go grab the other system, and we'll give that one a stir too, and then we'll put them back on the shelf and let them dry further. So now I'm starting to second guess whether what I mentioned earlier was correct or not, whether it was in here that we did the tubes or it was the other one that had the tubes. If we find a whole bunch of cardboard bits in here, then we'll know that this was the one actually. But I believe it was the other system, and it was pretty cool to see how they did away with all the cardboard tubes that had been in here. I mean, it was, what, 12 days? 12 days since we last checked in on that system, 11 days since we last checked in on this one. All I'm really trying to do is evict any worms that are hanging out on this bubble wrap, since there's all kinds of little crevices for them to be in. It is a little bit tricky, and some of these bubbles are actually punctured. And hopefully I'm not going to have to figure out a way to fish worms out of the bubbles themselves. Alright, pretty sure we got the majority of them, hopefully all of them. Let's see. Here's another one. Right there, smack in the middle. A couple of them, 2 or 3 of them actually. Little guys. So they sure do blend in good. Especially when they're small, they're pretty tough to see. Hiding in between the bubbles of the bubble wrap. I guess that's the one good thing, is that there's like enough protection here between the bubbles and with the little bits of castings material stuck to the bubbles that will permit the worms to remain pretty damp and comfortable and safe. Then I could take a more thorough look at the plastic before we write it off. So here again, I'm just wondering if we can grab some of this stuff that was collected together over here. Here, this is not the cardboard. This is just a random material that I was sort of picking out of the stuff as I was going through it last time, and I kept piling it up until I had this really nice collection of this stuff. I figured, why don't we just extract it now? Lock, stock, and barrel. I guess my only concern is that I might have bought a few worms with this stuff. Alright. I'm going to have to figure out something to do with this stuff. Perhaps this stuff could be used as sort of a bed. Ooh, what am I doing? Going the wrong direction here. Going that way now, right? Maybe I can start setting up a little baiting station in that other package of castings only from when I light harvested the other system a few days ago, 5 days ago. And use this as the foundation for setting up a little baiting station to try to round up the worms out of that other stuff. Although if it is really, cocoons that I want to see hatch and round up the babies that come out of cocoons, I'm really weeks away from that. But, no harm in setting it up in advance. So I suppose I can keep trying to pick off some of this stuff here and there. But we don't have to be too thorough. All I was really after was to blend in some of the more dry stuff, and we'd always seen here how the material on these 2 outer edges was a lot drier than what was down the middle, because down the middle was where we were adding cucumber and food, and usually the foods are, what brings the moisture to the system. So down here in the middle is where we're probably going to see the most damp stuff. I'm wondering if it might make good sense just to pick out any other little bits of leftover food items. This looks like the skin of a tomato. I mean, it's been quite a while since we last fed these 2 systems, because last time it was really just a check-in. It wasn't even a feeding. So, I mean, we had the foraging time frames on the board there, right? I think it was like 22 and 23 days. So it's been over 3 weeks since this bin was last fed a regular meal. But still, you see stuff like leftover cantaloupe rind bits, that skin of a tomato, and there's all kinds of other little bits of leftover scraps of bedding and whatnot in here too. All stuff that the worms could utilize as food, so you need not worry about them starving. But I guess the only goal here was to uncover and to homogenize, I suppose, to bring in the more dry stuff from the outer edges, sort of blend it with the more damp stuff that's in the middle where the feedings had been getting applied. Here too, I could feel the stuff starting to stick to my fingers a little bit, suggesting that it's probably a little too damp still to be managed the way we had hoped to manage it with the screen. I'm just trying to think of a good way to blend in all the dry stuff with the more damp stuff. Maybe it's just a matter of sort of moving it all around, sloshing it all back and forth. And then between putting the dry stuff together with the more damp stuff, plus leaving it uncovered, plus giving it more time to air out, perhaps we'll get a better result if we were to try this again in another, week or 2. I guess I'm just looking for stuff that still feels like it's clumpy enough that it would not be able to pass through the screen. I'm sure there's a good bit of it here. And I'm just gonna blend it all together. And maybe I need not wait another, 12 days before checking in here again. Perhaps just 5 or 6 days would be enough for the top surface to dry out to the point where it would be beneficial to use that material, blend it all in one more time, in with the rest of the stuff to further help it all dry and become a lot more loose and flaky throughout. So maybe that's what I'll do. Maybe I'll just come back in here in another 5 or 6 days, if it looks like the material on the top surface is dried, to blend it all together and do what I can to really make all this material nice and loose and flaky, such that we can pass it all through the screen and capture the worms we want to use for our little project. So I don't know, did I blend it all thoroughly enough? I'm not quite sure. Here and there I keep seeing these little strips of blue. I don't know what this material was, but it must have made its way into a batch of my prepared bedding. Some little piece of blue plastic material that got shredded and ended up in my bedding. And every time I see it, I just feel like I gotta fish it out because the stuff ain't compostable. It's just some sort of plastic or whatever. Alrighty, well, I'm definitely curious to see what people are gonna provide as far as feedback in the comments of this video. It's not often I back away from something I'm trying, but it's also not every day I try something I've never tried before. And it is true that my material isn't always so dry and loose and flaky that it would lend itself to screening the way I had hoped today. A lot of times my material is a little bit damp and clumpy. Not like in the early days. In the early days I used to run my bins very dry. People used to criticize how dry I used to run my systems. But nowadays I definitely provide a much more cozy and moist environment for the worms to hang out in, which I'm sure the worms appreciate and probably leads to healthier, more comfortable worms, because they do need that moisture in the surrounding materials to be able to breathe. But when the time comes to try something like this, the material still seems to be just a little bit too damp, preventing us from accomplishing our goals here. But whatever. I'm not put off. Those yellow buckets will just, continue to kind of mature and become even more comfortable of a place to put our breeder worms into at some point in the near future. And then we'll get that experiment started. But if we really want to be able to attempt this screening separation of the worms, which I've never tried before, this stuff's got to be a lot more granular and dry. So that's what we're going to be shooting for. Alright, well, I'm going to decide what to do with this stuff later. I think we're done here. I'm going to simply put this back on the shelf now uncovered, let it dry, and then, maybe come back in here in about a week's time, perhaps less, just to see how it's coming along, maybe blend it again, and then we'll try again in the near future. Alright, everyone, that's it for today's check-in with our red wigglers, my 2 oldest bins. Unfortunately, we weren't able to pull off the objective today, but we tried something new, and that's always fun too. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.